Hello, everyone. Welcome
Hi.
to the trailer, the stream trailer of Environmental History of Migration. My name is Andreas. I'm a volunteer at the Streams conference. I'm a design researcher. I will just kick off this session with some technical practicalities, really. For the attendees, you may use the Q&A. I'm sorry, I'm sharing the screen. Now you see me, I'm sorry. Just for the attendees, you can use the Q&A function to ask the participants questions, and also the chat to introduce yourselves and to share among resources. Yeah, that's all. Please take it away, Eunice.
Thank you, Andreas. Eunice, can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. We can start.
Yeah, I think we missed Gilberto, actually. Hi, everybody.
I can join.
Yeah, I wrote him.
Yeah, no, Gilberto raised his hand.
Okay, so it's only me
Yeah,
then.
maybe Andreas, can you check if Gilberto has any problem?
Yes, I'll find him. And
so we can start because we have just 1 hour.
Eunice, if you'd like, you can put on your camera too.
Yeah. Okay. Anisha, do you want to introduce us? Or do?
Yeah. Do you see me?
Okay. No, we cannot see you, but we can.
No.
Yeah. Let me try to see how I can. Here.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. I can see all.
Okay. Good.
Okay. Let's.
Should I introduce? I'll introduce myself first. You said that you would introduce me.
Okay, so hi, everybody. So this is our moderator, Eunice Nodari. She kindly agreed to moderate this session today. She works at the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. She's an expert on environmental history and migration.
Okay, I will introduce our colleagues today that will be the presentation, make the presentation. And in the same order that I say the names, you will answer the question. Then first we have Daniele Valiziana, PhD at the Division of History, Science, Technology, and Environment at the Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm. Gilberto Mazzoli, PhD candidate at the Department of History and Civilization at the European Institute of Florence, Italy. Ilaria Vani is an associate professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Science at the University of Technology in Sydney, Australia. Samira Peruque Moreto is a professor of history at the Federal University of Southern Borne, Brazil. Claudio de Maio is a PhD candidate at the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society, Munich, Germany. Roberto Biasillo, Environmental History at Division of History, Science, Technology, and Environment at the Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm. Introducing all of you, I will give some of the rules. Each of you have exactly 5 minutes, no more than that, because we have a short time to make all the presentations. And you should answer all of you should answer the same question. How would you define the environment in your research in environmental history of migration? And then, not losing time, just start with Daniele. Daniele, 5 minutes for you.
Okay, so thanks, Eunice, and thanks everybody for being here. This is a very composite panel because we're people from 3 continents. So thank you everybody for being here, and let's hope that internet doesn't fail on us. So yeah, I will try to reply to your question, Eunice. The environment, or the environments actually, in my research is like a crossroad. It is the meeting and the merging point of various routes and trajectories, which are both human and non-human. Those knots of trajectories, quoting Tim Ingalls, are layered in a geohistorical way, notably by the joint action of geological, geographical processes that all occur through time. So those trajectories I look for or try to retrace in my research are at once spatial, temporal, but also ecological. In that they always embed stories of the manifold relation between societies and nature through time. For instance, to give you an example, the cold landscape of southern Belgium, which I researched during my PhD years, can be understood as a layered geohistory of the relation between coal and humans that goes back all the way to the Carboniferous era or the Kelt's time, the Middle Ages, the modern time, all the way up to today. So it is also, it's for people who are into longue durée or deep history, can be a very long anthropocenic history, but you know, it's also very much a history of present time. Migration, I find, is such an interesting topic because, and here I'm quoting Armiero and Tucker, migrants are themselves nature on the move, but conversely, I would like to add that they set places on the move. And they do that by traversing and inhabiting those places anew with new practices, cultures, ecological understandings, new memories and history. And all those different practices and cultures and understanding, they hybridize those places and those stories. In fact, I think that I value mobility to be the key element of environmental history, in that it is by confronting, putting together apparently local, established, or if you will, proper ecologies with different ones that come from far away. It is in this way, by this confrontation, that we can see the constant interaction and transformation through time, the hybridity or the unruliness of places and environments. And we can see that through migrants. Migrants, they reveal that. So mobility to me is not solely something that pertains to our subjects as scholar, to our research. It is also a posture, you know, an active method that we might employ to unearth those hybrid migrant environments. In my case, I find that walking, for instance, so to use our body as a sensorial compass through the environment, it can be a very interesting methodology for retracing migrants to historical trajectories within the environment, the different environments that they traverse. So inevitably, I think that when we move, we end up crossing borders and frontiers. Borders and frontiers, they can be very different. They can be between states, they can be frontiers between urban environments and the countryside. They can be bodily frontiers between human and non-human bodies and the surrounding nature and the environment, but also between labor and technology. And all these different frontiers and borders, they are revealed to be porous, and also they're revealed to be as arbitrary actually as ever, a human construction, which sometimes is totally unnatural, if you let me use this term. So I'm not a big fan of Richelieu politics, the kind of natural frontiers, walls, and all alike things. I don't think that they really exist actually. So to conclude, I think that the environmental history of migration is inevitably an history of transpassing, crossing borders and frontiers. And as much as it tells stories of porous bodies, blurred human and non-human relation, it also reveals how environments are always unruly and hybrid. Thanks.
Thank you. Exactly on time, 5 minutes, Daniele. Now we are going to Gilberto Mazzoli, please. Gilberto.
Okay. Hi, hello. Thank you all for this invitation opportunity. And I don't think there are better words than Daniele's speech to answer to this question. And I would like to speak briefly about my research, and I am still reflecting on how to extrapolate the environmental in my research. My project is about Italians in the United States at the turn of the 20th century and their practices in urban context that deal with agriculture. That could be multiple, like from a basic gardening, or also raising animals, or dealing with wastes to use it as a fertilizer. And what I'm interested to is how they experienced a different landscape that in this case is an urban one, with their idea of landscape, and how with their resilience, in fact, they were proposing an alternative way of being modern, let's say, because at the time there was institution and the urban planners were proposing an idea of a city that was very ordered, structured, and clean. And within all these interstices, we can find also how racial dynamics also occurred. For instance, those who were working with garbage were migrants, and sometimes they were so discriminated because of that. And this happened to Italians and also Polish, Greeks, to other European migrants. And I think United States are a peculiar case because all these dynamics were also socially built by authorities with and social workers, like with all the theories of assimilation of migrants and so on. So a good thing that environmental history of migration could do is also to dismantle all these narratives and make order in all these narratives, unveiling how the environment as a place in classic migration histories. And by the way, also since I'm dealing with gardening and also migrant urban gardening, I think it is important because our garden of migrants could be defined as transnational places, because you have seeds from your home country or techniques, maybe more vernacular techniques, applied in a new soil, in a new space. And since also in my research you have this different how to say idea of what was modern at the time. So the city must not have these spaces as a random space managed by migrants, for instance. It was a situation when ideal city was built over this kind of migrant experience. So also dynamics of conflict could arise if we look at this. And to sum up, I mean, I agree also with Daniele said, and with what Marco Armier and Richard Tucker wrote, when they say that as environmental historians of migration, we should unveil how migrants experience landscape. And for instance, in the case of agriculture, which crops they brought with them, and how they were introduced, and how their relationship with with this new environment have been affected by structures of power and dynamics of race, class, and gender, for instance. And I'm done.
Thank you, Gilberto. Now we are calling Ilaria Vani.
Thank you. Can I show you pictures? Can I show you pictures? Yes? Okay, let's try. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I am really excited to be in this forum. My name is Ilaria Vanni, and I want to start saying that I live on Gadigal land, and I want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And where I live was, is, and will always be Aboriginal land. So in this line, I also want to pay my respect to the elders past, present, and futures, because they are the traditional custodians of country and of knowledge. In academia, I am a design historian / ethnographer, and I have a strong interest in environmental practices in cities and in plants. And much of my work is done in collaboration with my co-author and co-researcher and co-conspirator, Alexander Crosby, through our research studio, which is called Mapping Edges. And we work in transdisciplinary mode, doing quite a lot of design interventions. And our latest effort is this edited issue of visual communication, where we explored how visual communication can make present recombinant ecologies in cities. And recombinant ecologies is one of the recurrent theme in my work, and this is how the environment plays out in my research, the idea of recombination. So Mapping Edges clearly informs also and overlaps with my research on the Italian diaspora and environmental practices in Sydney. So my research question, if I had to pick one for this project, is what practices, what effects, and what social relations plants engender when they travel from one place to another. And in summary, to answer these questions, I'm trying to summarize here in 3 main concepts. And the first one is transcultural landscape. So my starting point is that, however we look at it, Sydney is a transcultural landscape because it is the result of thousands of years of Aboriginal agriculture that are layered with colonial histories and then with migrant histories. So my definition of transculturation is based on 2 key texts. One is Marie-Louise Pratt's Context Zone as social spaces where different cultures come into contact and grapple with each other and clash. And the other one is the idea of misplacement, which is theorized by Silvia Spitta as the reshuffling of known orders, as the disruption that is caused by things that arrive from another place into an order of things in the Foucauldian sense. The second concept that has been already introduced is the one of migrant gardens. So I think of gardens as contact zones between different order of things. And I used the Phoenician migrant gardens to refer both to gardens that are made by migrants, such as this one that you see here, and also as gardens that are made by misplaced plants, by migrant plants, if you want. And plants generate relations between localities, people, effects, and also they create material and a material and sensory dimension that I'm quite interested about, because I am, after all, interested in design. And plants generate transcultural landscapes on very different scales. So for instance, one of the gardeners I interviewed told me that her family coming from Trieste to Sydney in Australia had no idea of gardening at all, being from the city. But they immediately dedicated a small little patch to the cultivation of a special chicory that comes from Trieste, which is called Cicoria zuccherina da taglio, and which cannot be found in greengrocers in Sydney because it bruises very easily. So it was just a tiny little patch. On the other hand, when I walk around in places where there are quite a lot of Italian migrants, I see this kind of landscape. So there are plants that literally spill out of the front garden to go on the verge, for instance, these olive trees that you see. And in this way, they define a Sydney landscape. And sometimes they really escape.
Can you conclude, please?
Yes. Okay. So my third concept is the one of appaisamento, which comes from the Martino as a practice to make, to basically create a sense of home after being spaesati, losing a sense of home, which comes from, the experience of migration. So in conclusion, what I want to say is just that in my research, migrant gardens and the environment are sites of really complex entanglements that are cultural, social, and also environmental.
Thank you, Ilaria. Now we are going to my colleague from Brazil, Samira Perucchi Moreto. Samira, please.
Hi, everybody. Hello. So my name is Samira Perucchi Moreto. First, I'd like to say thank you very much for the invitation to be part of this conversation. So to answer this question, I need to talk a little bit about my trajectory. So I have been researching with environmental history since I was undergraduate student under Professor Eunice Sueli Nodari. In my doctoral dissertation, I researched about the dissemination and the domestication of feijoa. It's a native fruit from the south of Brazil and Uruguay. And when I was researching about this fruit, connected me with a group of Italian immigrants in south of Brazil. The question around my thesis dissertation was, why this fruit is so famous in different kinds of other countries like Colombia, New Zealand, USA, and the people in Brazil don't know about this fruit. So the answer for this question is not for today, but because that connects me with this special kind of group of immigrants on the south of Brazil. This Italian group, when arrived in Brazil, they found the littoral area occupied for the other kind of immigrants in Brazil, like Portuguese, like Germans, and the other groups of Italians. So how the littoral area, the flat lands around the rivers was occupied for this group, they needed to have other option to buy lands in the other areas in the middle of the Atlantic forest. So these areas around the rivers and the littoral areas were so expensive, and the areas in the highlands in the middle of the forest was much more cheaper compared with this in the littoral. So after this context, I can put the spotlight the relation with this Italian group between the environmental. The first thing is that these Italian families, they mostly were farmers and depended on the agriculture productions to survive. The second one is to start the agriculture to need to take down the forest, and because that they had a lot wood around them, they started a new economic activity connected with the lumber companies. But there one other important information that I need to tell, that these areas, when they arrived in the highlands in the south of Brazil, in P, in Rio Grande do Sul states, was not empty. These areas was occupied by indigenous groups, former slaves, and this group, they didn't have a formal did land, and because that they were outcast or pressured to live in the movement to the peripheral areas. So I can resume the relationship between these Italian immigrants that lived in IP in different phases and levels. The first one, I can tell that then arrived, they needed to adapt to live in this new area in the middle of Atlantic forest, and they needed to adapt themselves in a conditional environmental. The second step, the second level of the integration, the relationship with the environmental, we started when then I started the deforestation. So this activity allowed them to develop the economy of the colonies, but put in danger the equality of the environment and the biology in this area. So they needed to learning a lot of their techniques, agriculture with the indigenous group that live in there. And I can tell that it had a cultural mixer because of that. So after years, they practice agriculture using pesticides, and they change the way they have the relationship with the environmental in the end of the 80s. In the end of the 80s, this Italian group, they started one new activity with one agroecological center in IP. With this center, mostly of these offsprings of Italians, immigrants, they are practicing nowadays the agroecological agriculture and seeking the environmental preservation and the social justice. I think that I'm done.
Thank you, Samira. Now we are going to Claudia De Marro, PhD candidate at the RCC. Claudia, please take the floor.
Okay, do you hear me, everybody? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Okay, thank you to everybody thank you, first of all, Rebecca, for organizing this, for giving us this opportunity. Thanks to Anissa for accepting to moderate us. So yeah, I consider myself kind of a beginner in this field. So I'm not sure I could add so much about that. I would say that I've been following the development of this field from the beginning, but I barely started working on migrations. And I especially dedicated on southern Brazil, on the example of southern Brazil and the wine production in the country, which is a research that also Professor Eunice has worked on a lot. So there is already in this particular case, there is already a vast focus of production about this field, especially from traditional histories. There's a lot from Italy, there's a lot from Brazil. And these stories are in a way kind of environmental already, because they all talk about the settlement years, the negotiation of the land, how the land was allotted and distributed among the immigrants. It's a migration that happened in the 70s of the 19th century. So it's kind of a late migratory flow compared to the other communities in Brazil. In this time, it's in the south of Brazil. So this community got some uplands territories that were actually inhabited by indigenous people. And so there is a whole story of then, like occupying the territory, and marking the land with very specific practices that make the Italian identity very unique in this land and this is why Italians are considered, in a way, to be foreigners. They are called gringos to these days, as if they were a bit kind of a different identity compared to the rest of the country. But in my perspective, what really has helped me, what environmental history has helped me with in studying this case, is the fact that I was able to also reveal some side aspects of this story that were not really touched upon by conventional narratives. In a way, there is a tendency to talk about the identitarian way in which the landscape was shaped, the place-making processes, but the story lacks a bit some aspects of, I would say, dirt that environmental history always reveals. We had a discussion in Villa Vigoni last year about how environmental history can be useful to reveal the side aspects, the side stories that sometimes are untold in conventional narratives. And so I guess that this is what really this story has taught me, because you start working on the way the Italians shape the land producing wine, and you end up seeing that there is a story of eviction of indigenous people, there is a story of social contest, there is a story also of cheating from the Brazilian government somehow to these communities in a way, because they didn't get what they expected in some instances. There is a story of deforestation, there is a story of environmental destruction, and then there is a story of a plant, there is a wine plant that doesn't come from Italy, that becomes one of the wine plants that allows Italians to be Italians again in this land. So I guess it's a very interesting story. Nowadays, of course, agricultural technologies allowed better development of the area, but at the time, we don't know without this plant how this area would have turned out. Maybe it would not have become this winemaking production area because traditional wine species didn't make it in this climate. So it's a very interesting story, I think, and this is the good part of environmental history, revealing these complexities, this material complexity, I would say, behind these stories. I would say that for me, environmental history of migration means also to look at how different materialities can shape cultural processes and vice versa. So it's a bit, looking at the crossroads between nature and culture, how these two very complex field of existence in a way overlap, and they contaminate each other and shape historical processes. I think I could stop it here.
Thank you, Claudio. It's we are not hearing you anymore, but I think it's finished your presentation. Okay, then now we are going to Roberta, one of the organizers with Daniele. Roberta, please take the floor, it's your time.
Okay, yes, I will be very short because some things have already been said. And my research is a peculiar case of Italian migration because it's a case of migration in a colonial context. My research is on the transformation of Libya during the fascist rule from 1922 to 1945. And through this story of migration, what I want to tell is the story of the fascist colonization, the Italian migration, and also the identity formation outside of the national borders. And Claudio just mentioned that. And the third element that is embedded in this story of migration is the environment making process through cultural and ecological transfers. And I will put together both the cultural and the ecological transfer when it comes to define what the environment is. So I won't go into my case studies, but I will try to explain when you want to tell a story of migration in a colonial context, how could you define the environment? And I just want to give two answers to that. And to answer to that, I will adopt two methodological approaches. The first comes from the environmental history of colonization, and the second comes from the environmental history of migration. Migration can be also, in my case, interpreted as mobility, just to stretch a bit the concept of migration. So that from the first approach, the environmental history of colonialism relies on the idea of exchange. So the pioneering book, to use a colonial term is by Alfred Crosby, and the concept of exchange is really important. The concept of exchange as really variants in the environmental history of colonization. We can also have transfer, for example, or flows. So if you want to stress the role of the environment, the first way is to look at the biological movements across countries and within the same country. So we can look at plants, animals, humans, and disease. So this is the very beginning of the history of colonialism. And of course, mobility and migration is part and parcel of this subfield of the environmental history. So from this perspective and from this methodological approach, we focus a lot on the ecological transfers. But if I instead apply an approach coming from the environmental history of migration, and again, I want to mention another founding book edited by Mark Armiero and Richard Tucker, Environmental History of Modern Migration. So if we adopt their perspective, what does the environment become? The environment becomes a social actor, a social space, besides being an ecological space, of course, that is already said. So the environment emerged from stories, ideas, and relations that belongs to communities and individuals. And the environment can be, of course, the space taken by the pioneers, but is also the place where stories of exploitation, of displacement, and also competitions across ethnic groups. This is really important if we want to define the environment, because the competition generally is a competition over natural resources and over space. So space also can be thought as a part of the environment in a colonial context. Also in a case of intercolonialism, because there are different definitions of colonialism. And then another thing that is really useful now to reflect on, and especially, and I saw one question, so I will embed it in my answer now. So, and the nexus of climate change and migration now also ask us to rethink in terms of sustainability. Is a migration flow sustainable? And is a colonial migration sustainable? And how can we rate sustainability, success, and failure through the environment? It seems like an easy question, but it's not so easy to reply, because generally the environmental transformation has always been framed as a modernization process, an improvement process, and especially with relation to the Italian diaspora, the Italian migrants were seen as farmers, as people that improved, and we have this term bonifica, which is literally the improvement of the landscape. So how can we reframe the transformation in a migration and colonial context without associating this transformation with the idea of bonifica, of improvement and modernization? I can stop here.
Thank you, Roberta. We have 5 minutes I can make some comments. I would like first remember that Mark Armiero and Donald Worcester probably realized in 2013 at the Rachel Carson Center a workshop for environmental history, migration. It was amazing at that time because we didn't find, I was one of the participants. At that time, we didn't find a lot of bibliography. A lot of students were not doing it. What we found most of the time were migration without the environment. And now, today, we see a group of professors and students doing this kind of research. What I was thinking is, while all of you are talking about the immigration, being Italian or not, well, we really have no comparison studies about this. When Daniele was talking about the coal mines, I remember that here in the south of Brazil, we have a coal mines with Italian immigrants too. And when Ilaria was talking about the gardens, I was just remember that we have a big difference in the gardens made by the Italian immigrants here in Brazil and by the German ones. And then she showed these pictures. It's very similar to the one that we have here. Claudio and Samira too, they were talking about plants, about some regions that are similarities. And Gilberto, when Gilberto was talking about, probably it was the one that was making more of the urban immigrants, the way that Marco is doing. So we can see a lot of similarities, and we should think of in the future, make more comparative studies of migration. I have other discussions, but I don't think that we have time because I see that we have 4 questions, and I think it's more mainly is very important for answer the question that our people that are seeing us to answer. So Daniele, can you take the floor and read the questions, please?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, we have quite some questions. I'm not sure we can answer to all of those. We can try. So the first one goes like this: how might an environmental history of migration be useful for reworking practices of belonging, both for migrants and people staying put? I'm reading it out loud as I saw it. So yeah, basically how we can use environmental history of migration to understand and to reframe practice of belonging and identity, both for migrants and for local people, I would say, in a complicated time as the one we live in. Who wants to answer?
I briefly addressed that question, saying that if we have to, okay, what is climate change for me as a researcher is a way to reframe and rethink what are the main questions we should pose ourselves and what are the founding values of our society. So if the ecological crisis is really relevant, that should inform all our research. And the idea of sustainability can be used in different ways in all our research. And I try to reply to that saying that I should reflect more on how can we define sustainable and unsustainable immigration flow. Because also we want to call for a world without borders, or a world that where everyone is free to find the place that he or she wants. We also need to find a way to claim that the movement is not unsustainable. So what is unsustainable in the migration is something that adopting an environmental history perspective can help us to highlight.
Yeah, do we have other?
It can be also useful if some of us can pick and choose one question and try to address it. I don't know.
Okay, so we don't have everybody answering to one question. Yeah, no, maybe it's not very useful in that way. But if anybody wants to add something to what Roberta said, please raise your hand and just intervene. I don't want to mute anybody. Otherwise, I will go forward. So another attendees asked, how do we deal with giving voices to non-humans in our research, to non-human agency especially, and how can that help us, build a new ecological and social space where migrants, where migrants are part of.
Maybe I can say something about this.
Please.
So I, simply because I think about this question the whole time, so it is very hard to give agency to non-humans, so simply because agency is such a loaded term. So rather than what I'm doing, rather than talking about agency, is I'm asking a different but connected type of question, which is what kind of issues gather around, say, plants, or around animals, around more than humans entanglements and more than humans assemblages. In that way, you can think of the way that, and I'm a plant lady, so I'm thinking about plants, and I think about how plants specifically gather some ideas, some issues, but also plants make publics in a way. So there are you know, in terms of migration, for instance, there are a lot of networks that get created by plant activities. For instance, people might exchange seeds or cuttings or give each other advice on how to grow certain plants and so on and so forth. So that, you know, I've been looking at domestic gardens, which is such an intimate practice in a way, but it actually isn't. It is a form of civic ecology because it creates networks. And it creates networks because plants enroll humans in doing certain things, like in, you know, exchanging cuttings, in, I don't know, growing certain types of trees rather than others that change the landscape and so on and so forth. So I think it's a matter of, you know, thinking about what we mean with agency, really.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ilaria. So yeah, is there anybody who wants to add something to this? Okay, so maybe I can say one very quick thing. I mean, in my case, when it comes to non-human agency, I try to frame it more in terms of ecological relation, and sometimes, you know, the very center of this kind of ecological relation might be not a human component, as in case for my PhD research, coal had a huge role, like a perceivable role into structuring the ecology of southern Belgium, which is the area that I studied. And to an extent that you can even talk about kind of metabolism, which informs the relation between societies, nature, and all the environments which has been created, which is hybrid and human, non-human, and more than human even to that extent. If somebody wants to add something else, otherwise I will go through the next question. Okay, I don't see anybody raising hands. So another question from Marco Armiero, since we mentioned him. Do we need large distances to do an environmental history of migration or mobilities? Can we do a small scale environmental history of migration? For instance, migration from the countryside to the city, from one region to another in the same country, so internal migration. Yeah, what do you think about that?
May I try to answer? No, I agree. I think that we can also do a small-scale environmental history of migration. And for instance, in the case of Italy, could be very interesting because Italy was shaped by a lot of internal migration after the Second World War, especially from mountain areas to the city and from countryside to the city. And so we could have a lot of micro-scale history. And for instance, in the case of gardening, I clearly remember about my hometown, Modena. I did some interview about people that manage social allotments for elder people in the city. And they say that they came from mountain areas and they arrived in Modena in the 70s, and they don't want to stay at the bar, but they wanted to do what they were doing in the mountains, so gardening. And so they set up all this environment, and that later became contact zones, as Ilaria said, because there were also migrants from other parts of Europe that arrived in Italy and went and asked to have a garden. And so the participation and the sharing of knowledge was very very dense. And I think that could be very interesting to adopt a smaller scale for approach migration.
Thank you, Gilberto. Does anybody want to add something? Ilaria, maybe? Please
Yes,
go.
thank you. Yes, I'm quite interested in it is not really smaller scale because we are talking about Australia and nothing is really small. But I'm interested in how there was a first, migration of people from Italy who resettled in Queensland to be cane cutters and tobacco farmers. Both are terrible jobs. And once they made enough money, they migrated internally in Australia to Sydney, where they started, gardens. And I'm quite interested in this particular history. So I started to do some archival research. But it was interrupted by COVID. The library was closed and so on and so forth. So I'm quite looking forward to do this because I'm interested in the small scale, partly because I do really fine-grained ethnography. So it's easier for me to work on a smaller scale rather than, history as such.
Anybody wants to intervene? Otherwise, I might add a very small thing. Yeah, I'm also like, I come from a microhistory background, so I definitely value smaller scale trajectories, which doesn't mean, the distance needs to be small. It's just that the group or like which doesn't need to be human solely. You focus on, it's just small and located like in a definitely it can be a village or like a small hamlet and all that. And that might actually bring out more a complex identity and belonging issue, which might get lost in the bigger picture of like state dynamics, I think. Then maybe I can read another question. So, do you draw from a first-person perspective in your studies? If so, how does that inform your studies? It's a very interesting question. Somebody wants to say something?
If no one wants to say something, I can say this is the hardest part for me. Yeah, like individual stories and how to scale up from individual stories to group stories. Because I don't know, at least for my research, when it comes to discuss Italian colonialism and Italian migration due to colonialism, was a state enterprise. And we can have individual stories that matter for the early stage of the fascist group, for example. If I think about my research, there were really individual stories, and you can trace a single person as single pioneers. But when the colonization became a state enterprise, I shift from a more individual focus to a more state perspective. But I think what the environmental history of migration really wants to do is to valorize individual stories and also perspectives and different ideas of nature. So how a single person can see a nature somewhere else, it's really important. And this is something we have to train ourselves because it's not easy. And I think this is an issue we are all dealing with together with the issue of agency. How we can use the non-human perspective, and especially, I don't know, again, I refer to myself, if I want to use a non-human perspective, how can I stress the colonial context? It's very hard, because the colonial context is a question of power, and uneven power relations need also a human perspective. So it's something we have to think and work and exercise and see if the story we end up with makes sense and have all these layers. So there is no right perspective. It's just how can you add different layers in a single perspective. Are we running out of time, Andreas?
Yeah, I think we have to finish our session. First, I have to thank all of you, Daniele, Roberta, and Marco, for the invitation. And it was a very good discussion. discussion today, and I hope to see you again in another meeting, virtually or personally. Goodbye.
I want to thank all of you for accepting our invitation. And just a side information, we are working on a common publication, so especially short journal, where all this research can be placed together. We still don't know if we will manage, but if you're interested, yeah, you can contact us and we can see more of that. So thank you, Ilaria, Claudio, Daniele, Andreas, Samira, Gilberto, and Alicia.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much.
Thank you.
Good night and good day.
We'll have a
Thank
short
you.
break now. Please,
Bye-bye.
session. See you soon.
Stay home. Thank you, Andreas, for the conduction.